Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. You know, one of the fascinating aspects about the emergence of rock and roll was it was also taking place at the same time as the development of the space race. And you know, this affected music. British producer Joe Meek, he produced tracks like Telestar, and they incorporate all these sounds to give a kind of extraterrestrial feel to the music, kind of spacey sounds. And you know, as the psychedelic era developed, there were numerous tracks that incorporated space concepts. You know, there's stuff like the Beatles track Flying. Jimi Hendrix has tracks like 1983, A Mermaid I Should Be, and of course you got David Bowie's Space Oddity, and then Pink Floyd, you know, all those tracks like Interstellar Overdrive, Astronomy Donomy, and of course Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. But you know, there was one band that would emerge at the beginning of the 70s that would make space sort of like the conceptual center of their sound, the foundation of what they were trying to do. And of course that band was Hawkwind. Okay, thank you for tuning in to 20th Century Music and Arts. Just so you know, this is me on the mic, this is raw, and this is not AI. So let's learn about Hawkwind. Okay, so Hawkwind's roots go back to a band that Dave Rock had played in with Mick Slatery called The Famous Cure. And the two of them would soon be joined by John Harrison, Nick Turner, Michael Dick Mick Davies, and Terry Ollis. Okay, with Hawkwind, I'm not going to keep track of every single member and every single album. That's just going to be too much. I'd need an extra 30 minutes to do that. But there was this idea for them to create music that would incorporate electronic music and ideas from science fiction. And the group had actually become friends with the new wave science fiction writer, Michael Moorcock. There was a big new wave science fiction happening in the UK at that time. A lot of cool authors. Their first gig, the band that they put together didn't have a name, and they kind of just like forced themselves onto the bill, and they said, hey, we're Group X. But you know what? Lucky for them, John Peel was in the audience, and he told the organizer of the festival, hey, keep a watch on this band. And they basically just jammed on the track, by the Byrds, 8 Miles High. Maybe that's another proto-space rock song. No, lucky for them, though, they would get signed to Liberty Records. Yeah, in both negative and positive ways throughout the band's career, this kind of represents Hawkwind. Everything kind of happens in a disorganized, spur-of-the-moment kind of way, for the good and for the bad. Now, I looked at the roots of the name of Hawkwind, and I was expecting some sort of deep, esoteric meaning, but in fact, it's just based on the fact that one member was famous for hawking up spit, and another member was a notorious farter. So we have hence Hawk and Wind. Good stuff. Now, they would go into the studio in April 1970 to record their debut, and at this point, the lineup was Dave Brock on vocals, acoustic guitar, harmonica, some percussion, Nick Turner playing saxophone. He's also doing vocals, some percussion as well. Hugh Lloyd on lead guitar, John Harrison bass, Terry Ollis drums, and Dick Mick was in charge of the electronics. Okay, this is probably one of the last few times I go into that much detail about what each Hawkwind member is doing, because there's been so many guys in the band. Now, Dick Taylor from the Pretty Things, he produced the album, and he added some guitars as well. Now, the sound here gives a hint of what's to come. The opener, Hurry on Sundown, and the closer, Mirror of Illusion of the album, they have that kind of busker, street hippie vibe. There's a bit of acoustic guitars in there, melody. And, Hurry on Sundown's quite a melodic track. But the rest of the album is just one big space rock jam. I think the original piece was called Sunshine Special, but ended up being broken up into several different tracks when they were recording. What was fantastic about Hawkwind was this band they jam on these heavy trance-like riffs, and then there'd be all these strange electronic sounds that filled the atmosphere. And this was quite different from something like, I don't know, like the Grateful Dead, who would jam on these sort of intricate guitar parts. With Hawkwind, it's like heavy minimalism, contrasted with this like psychedelic anarchy. And unlike many of the big rock stars who'd moved away from the hippie dream by, 1970 or so, you think of like the Rolling Stones and all these bands who were kind of living in mansions and stuff. Hawkwind, they were true believers to sort of the hippie life and the alternative lifestyle and all that. No incident sums this up more than their gig at the Isle of Wight festival. Rather than getting an invite to the festival itself, I mean, maybe they weren't famous enough, they actually played outside of the festival in a massive tent for free. Apparently it was quite a terrifying experience being in this big blown up tent, because earlier many protesters or true believers of the hippie cause, they had tried to break into the festival, and there were apparently violent clashes. At one point the festival was declared free. But, Hawkwind, they played their free show, I think along with T2 and the Pink Fairies, right outside the fence there. And they showed their hippie credentials, and that was kind of disappearing, and things were kind of mainstreaming by the early 70s. Now, they would go back in the studio in 1971 to record their second album, In Search of Space. Now, with this album, the band came into the terms of what they were trying to do. They really came into their own sound here. The album brings this heavy, hypnotic, distorted guitar. It's right at the forefront. It's almost like punk sounding, but hypnotic. There were lineup changes, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but the band also used something called an audio generator that would create all these weird sounds, and then they have synthesizer, really early synthesizer in there as well. It's like a heavier version of a krautrock band, thinking like Can, Neu, Faust, but it's thicker and heavier than that. And there's also like some acoustic guitar moments, and there's saxophone and flute being played over. Now, if you want to start with Hawkwind, I would say get this album first. I remember being completely mesmerized by this sound when I first heard it. Someone had gotten a record of Hawkwind. I'd maybe heard the name before, but I'd never heard the music. And when I heard it, I was like, wow, this is awesome. It starts out with the unrelenting 15 minutes, You Shouldn't Do That. Then you get this cerebral, You Know You're Only Dreaming, and then Side 2 starts out with one of the greatest rock songs of all time, Master of the Universe. It's this Hawkwind heavy riffing with space sounds at its best. This song is incredible. They have the acoustic, We Took the Wrong Step. And then there's this like weird experimental thing called Adjust Me, where like the voice, the speed of the voice is all changed. And then there's the plotting and hypnotic Children of the Sun. Get yourself this album. Listen to this album. This album's awesome. Now, Ian Lemmy Kilmister, known as Lemmy, he's brought in as the new bass player. He had actually been a roadie for Jimi Hendrix, and he played guitar in his own bands like the Rocking Vickers and Sam Gopal. Now, he apparently did an audition to be a guitar player. That didn't work out, but they needed a bass player, so they kind of shoved him on stage with a bass, an instrument he'd never played before, but it turned out okay. And one of the gigs was at this thing called the Greasy Truckers gig in February 1972. One song released from that gig was Silver Machine. It was actually written by a new band member called Robert Calvert. He was like this eccentric writer, sometimes singer. But Lemmy was on vocals. I believe those vocals had later been overdubbed in the studio. I might be wrong about that though. But this song was actually a hit on the charts, reaching number 3. And the sales meant that they can invest more in the recording of their next album, which was the fantastic Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. This album's great. It starts out with the hard-driving Brainstorm. You've got the melodic and cerebral Spaces Deep, the very rocking Lord of Light. The menacing Time We Left This World Today. It's got these eerie chanting vocals, droning but builds up. And then there's this great acoustic number called The Watcher. It's got Lemmy on vocals. The layout of the packaging was cool. There's like this whole legend on the back. There's this whole like code system to deal with the notes and the planets and stuff. And this, part of it says, the saga of Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti Do is a collection of ritualistic space chants, battle hymns, and stellar songs of praise, and are used by the family clan of Hawkwind on their epic journey to the fabled land of Thorazin. Yeah, there were a lot of hallucinogenic drugs in that group. And the band, they bring this concept to life with this incredible, magnificent space ritual tour. They had played this show, apparently had these really incredible light shows, and they got Robert Calvert come up with this weird poetry. They've got these dancers, especially this 6-foot Irish woman, Stacia, who would strip naked and paint herself in colors. It must have been an incredible spectacle. And it would be captured on this live album called Space Ritual, Alive in Liverpool and London. There were also some new songs in the set, including Born to Go, Orgon Accumulator, and Sonic Attack, which was actually written by Michael Moorcock. Man, you got to check out the Space Ritual album. Again, that album has this amazing gatefold, how it folds out and everything. Really cool. Now, Robert Calvert, he wrote and sang this next single, Urban Gorilla. And this song's actually very straightforward and melodic. I mean, almost poppy even, especially by Hawkwind standards. But the lyrics about a person making bombs in the basement. And this was a time when the IRA were setting off bombs in London. So it was not going down well with the authorities. And of course, the BBC refused to play it. And even though they played the B-side, Brainbox Pollution, which is actually cool, it sounds like a 50s rock and roll song done space rock style. The band decided to withdraw the single. The band did undertake their first tour of North America. Member Del Detmar, he actually bought some land outside of Calgary, which hinted that he was probably going to leave the band soon. The follow-up album was Hall of the Mountain King. That came out in 1974. Now, Simon House, he played in High Tide in the Third Ear Band. He joined. He's adding like violin to the sound. It's really, really cool. However, Robert Calvert and Dick Mick were no longer part of the band. The sound in this album is good. It's not as raw and distorted as the two previous albums, but it does have this sort of new level of sophistication. Hawkwind, they kind of occupy this space where you got like psychedelic rock, hard rock, sort of proto-punk and progressive rock, and they're all kind of existing simultaneously. The opening track, Psychedelic Warlords, shows this concept well. Another highlight track is the absolutely epic D Rider. There's the upbeat and rockin' You Better Believe It. Title track is pretty tripped out piano kind of thing. And then Lemmy sings his great track called Lost Johnny. Closing track, Paradox, gives us that Hawkwind epicness again. A slightly more fine sound, but still pretty awesome. The band toured throughout 1974, including North America. For their next album, they collaborated with Michael Moorcock, who actually wrote many of the lyrics for the album. The album, Warrior on the Edge of Time, it was based on one of Moorcock's novels. This album is probably their best produced in terms of actual production. But again, this is fantastic epicness to it still. Highlight tracks include Assault and Battery Part 1, the tripped out instrumental Opa Loca, the epic Magnu, great songs like The Dying Seas and Kings of Speed. The last song might have been a description of Lemmy, who preferred amphetamines to psychedelics, and this actually had become a problem for the band because he'd stay up for a week and he'd crash for a week. But in May 1975, he was crossing the border from US into Canada, and he got busted for the speed he was carrying, though the Canadian authorities thought it was cocaine. Apparently, he spent a night in jail handcuffed to a bar and then was released without charge. But he was fired from the band. The last track he wrote and played on was the B-side for the Kings of Speed single, and that song was called Motorhead. And that would be the name of the new band he would form. But you know what? That's another story and another video. There would be a few interesting albums that were also released that were connected with Hawkwind. Robert Calvert released a satirical album, really strange thing called Captain Lockheed and his Starfighters. It actually has actor scripts in between the songs.
Next.
You want to buy airplanes?
That is correct.
Well, we make them good ones.
And he has another album called Lucky Leaf and the Longships. And, members of Hawkwind also participated on an album called New World's Fair, and it's Michael Moorcock and his band Deep Fix. These are really interesting albums you should check out. Stacia left the band, and Robert Calvert, he actually rejoins the group and becomes the lead vocalist for a while. Paul Rudolph, who played in the Pink Fairies, was now on bass. They released the album Astounding Sounds, Amazing Music. The title and the cover reference, classic science fiction magazines like Astounding and Amazing Stories. The sound of this album is definitely cleaner and more melodic than previous albums. And the sound is, it's very much mid-70s. It's got its prog elements. It's even got times elements of like soul and funkiness in it. Standout tracks include Reefer Madness, Steppenwolf, and Curb Crawler. Now, Nick Turner was fired from the band. Apparently, he would play over others live when it was time for like a chorus to sing or a solo by another instrument. He'd be just wailing a saxophone over top. And in 1977, they released Quark's Strangeness and Charms. And again, the band continued to go in a more melodic direction. It's even almost poppy at times. I mean, it's still space rock Hawkwind. Some of the songs are direct references to science fiction novels like Damnation Alley, that's the name's taken directly from a Roger Zelazny novel, and The Iron Dream, which is taken from the title of a Norman Spinard book. Now, the opening track, Spirit of the Age, written by Robert Calvert, is based on a poem of his. From what I understand, the lyrics are about a space traveler whose true love was not put into a deep freeze. Maybe he was put into a deep freeze when he's on a spaceship. So she would have died of old age by the time he returns to Earth. It's a great track and actually became a staple of the live performances. They still perform it today. They were recording most of the material that would make up the PX R5. Again, the sound here is poppier. There's a track called High Rise, named after the J.G. Ballard novel of the same name. But the problem was that Calvert would, he'd have these bouts of manic paranoia. He used to run around in like military fatigues and stuff and do all kinds of crazy actions, and then he'd just crash into depression, and that interfered with both European and North American tours. That it caused a lot of problem. And this caused Dave Brock, who'd really become the foundation of the band, he broke it up in 1978. Now, weirdly, he did reform again with Calvert, Simon House, and others just to play as under this name Hawk Lords. Now, they had left their management. I don't know if they were just trying to avoid legal issues by using the name Hawkwind. And they released the album 25 years on. And again, this album is even poppier. It's almost new wavy in sound. Now, there was new wave music being created by 1978, of course. But Hawkwind's early material, that heavier riff stuff, definitely had an influence on punk bands. John Lydon references, when you see an old photo of him pre-Sex Pistols with long hair, he describes it as his Hawkwind phase. Now, the track Flying Doctor off of this Hawk Lords album is really, really good. Now, PXR5 was eventually released in 1979. Brock would reform the band without Calvert. Now, unfortunately, Calvert would pass away from a heart attack in 1988 and struggle for the rest of his life with mental health issues. But the band now played some live shows, which would be released under an album called Live 1979. In 1980, they would release an album with Ginger Baker of Cream fame on drums called Levitation. And it was a return to the more rock sound that the band had earlier. Baker would only last one album, though. And, the constant member throughout this group has been Dave Brock. They've released albums since the 80s. They've had some that sound more metal. I think Sonic Attack is one of those. And they've even been influenced by the rave and techno scenes, especially in the 90s. But that core space rock sound has always been there. And, they're still going. Their latest album, Stories from Time and Space, it came out in April 2024. I remember seeing Hawkwind in, I believe, 1995. They were great. Hawkwind are an incredibly unique band that they create their own vision of music. It occupies, again, that space. You got psychedelia, proto-punk, proto-metal, and prog. It all kinds of meets in this area, but it's definitely Very, very unique music. And if you don't know this band, please check them out. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, share with other people. All right, I mentioned that. Remember, this is me on the mic. There's no AI narrative here. I'm doing the research myself. I'm putting these things together. And you know what? Let me know if you have a favorite Hawkwind song. Take care.